Level 1. The floor you were born on. Your mother ironed other people's clothes for a living. Not as a metaphor, literally. She stood in a small room in the back of a shop for 8 hours a day, pressing creases into shirts that cost more than she made in a week. She never complained, not once, and that silence taught you something you wouldn't understand for years. That poverty doesn't announce itself. It just becomes the weather. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing gravity. It's just there, pulling everything downward, quietly, constantly. Your father drove. Taxi, delivery, sometimes both. He left before you woke up and came back after the house was dark, and the only proof he existed on weekdays was the sound of the door and the smell of the outside world coming off his jacket, and the plate of food your mother left covered on the counter that was always empty by morning. He wasn't absent, he was consumed. There's a difference, but when you're 9 years old, the effect is the same.
Money was never discussed. It was felt. You felt it in the pause before your mother said yes or no to anything that had a price. You felt it in the specific way she held receipts, like they were evidence of something she'd been accused of. You felt it in the school shoes that were always slightly wrong. Not the brand the other kids wore. Not bad enough to be obvious. Just wrong enough for you to know. And knowing was enough. Knowing was always enough. Nobody told you there was a ceiling. That's the trick. The ceiling doesn't work if you can see it. It works because it disguises itself as common sense, as realism, as the reasonable, responsible understanding that people like you aim for stability, not wealth. That the highest aspiration available to your bloodline was a steady paycheck and a car that starts on the first try and a retirement that doesn't require your children to support you. That was the dream, the entire dream, and it fit inside a very small room. You accepted it. Of course you did. Children don't argue with the shape of the world. They just grow into whatever container they're placed in. And the container you were placed in was built for endurance, not expansion. It was built to hold, not to grow.
The most dangerous part was that it felt like love, because it was love. Your parents weren't limiting you out of cruelty, they were protecting you from disappointment. They'd seen what happens when people like them reach too far. The fall, the embarrassment, the debt that follows ambition that didn't land. They'd watched it happen to uncles and neighbors and cousins who tried, and the trying itself became a cautionary tale told over dinner. Remember what happened to him, remember. As if ambition was a disease with known symptoms, and their job was to make sure you never caught it. So you stayed low, you stayed grateful, you stayed inside the room, and the ceiling, the invisible one, the one nobody built on purpose but everybody maintained, that ceiling became the sky, the only sky you knew. Level 2, the crack. You're somewhere between 16 and 23 when it happens. The where doesn't matter, the when barely matters. What matters is the sentence. One sentence, read or heard or stumbled into, that rewires something in you permanently. Maybe it's in a book you picked up for no reason. Maybe it's in a video at 2 in the morning when the algorithm finally shows you something that isn't noise. Maybe it's a person, a real human being standing in front of you who grew up in the same soil you did and is now standing on ground you didn't know existed.
The sentence doesn't have to be profound. It usually isn't. It's something ordinary that lands at the exact angle needed to fracture the glass. Something like, I started with less than you. 5 words, and the ceiling cracks. Not dramatically, not with sound, just a hairline fracture that lets in a thin line of light. And once you've seen the light, you can't unsee it. That's the cruelty and the gift of awareness. It doesn't come with an off switch. You start paying attention differently. You read about money the way medical students read about anatomy, obsessively, secretly, and with the growing nausea of realizing how much you didn't know. You learn words your parents never used: compound interest, leverage, equity, asset allocation. They sound foreign because they are. They come from a country you were never given a visa to. You don't tell anyone. You've learned from watching. Your uncle talked about opening a restaurant for 2 years, and the family's response was a masterclass in soft discouragement. Nobody said don't. They said be careful, which means the same thing but leaves no fingerprints. Your best friend mentioned investing once, and someone at the table laughed, not maliciously, reflexively, the way people laugh when a child says something accidentally absurd. That laugh was a wall. You noted it. You learned to build in silence. So you start your thing, whatever the thing is. The side project, the late night hustle, the product, the service, the account you fund with whatever's left after rent. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you've stepped outside the room, and now you're standing in a space with no walls and no ceiling and no floor, and the freedom is indistinguishable from falling. Level 3, the desert. This is the part that takes years. And the years don't pass the way they do in stories. They drag, they stall, they loop. You have the same Tuesday 47 times, and each one feels like proof that nothing is working. 2 years in, maybe 3. You've put in hours that would qualify as a second job if the second job paid anything. It doesn't, or it pays so little that calculating the hourly rate would be an act of self-harm. You do the math anyway. You shouldn't. You do. The people around you have lives. Normal, visible, progressing lives. They go on vacations. They buy furniture. They talk about things that aren't the thing you're building. And you sit there, in the middle of a dinner you probably shouldn't have spent money on, and you feel the gap. Not between you and them, between where you are and where you thought you'd be by now. Your mother asks how the thing is going. She uses the word thing because she's never been sure what to call it, and you've never been sure how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound either delusional or boring. You say it's going well. She says that's good. She says your cousin got promoted. She says it like a weather report, but you hear it like a verdict.
The failures arrive. Not one dramatic failure. That would be easier. A dramatic failure has a story. These failures are small and cumulative, and each one removes a thin layer of confidence, the way sandpaper removes wood. So slowly you don't notice until your hand touches the surface and it's smooth in a way that means there's almost nothing left. You lose money, a specific amount, an amount that makes your stomach tighten when you think about it, an amount your father would have to work weeks to earn. You lost it in days, maybe hours. And you sit with the number, and the number sits with you, and neither of you sleeps well. There is a night. Everyone who has done this has the night. The 3 a.m. night. The one where the voice comes. And the voice is not dramatic. It's not the villain in a movie. It's worse. It's calm. It's reasonable. It sounds exactly like every adult who ever told you to be realistic. And it says the thing you're most afraid is true. This was never going to work for someone like you. The people who make it had something you don't. A connection, a safety net, a parent who understood this world. You have a mother who irons shirts. You have a father who drives. You have a ceiling that you cracked but never broke. Go back. Go back before you've lost more than you can recover. You sit with that voice for a long time. You don't argue with it. You can't. It has evidence, it has data, it has the specific, humiliating receipts of every attempt that hasn't worked. And then you get up, not because the voice is wrong, because going back means going back to the room, and you've already seen outside the room. You can't unknow the shape of the sky, so you keep walking, into the desert, away from the voice, toward nothing guaranteed. The loneliness changes you. Not in a way anyone can see, in a way that settles into your posture, your tone, the way you hold silence in a conversation. You become someone who processes alone, who celebrates alone, who grieves alone. Not because you want to, because the thing you're carrying has no translation in the language your people speak, and explaining it every time is more exhausting than just carrying it quietly.
Level 4. The signal. It happens on a day that has no reason to be important. An ordinary month, an ordinary screen, a number that wasn't there before. Maybe it's the first time your monthly revenue covers your rent without you having to touch your salary. Maybe it's the first time someone you've never met pays you for something that came entirely from your mind. Maybe it's an account balance that crosses a threshold you set 2 years ago and forgot about because you'd stopped believing it was realistic. You stare at it. The number. It's not life-changing. By any external measure, it's modest. But you know what's behind it. You know the nights, the failures, the 3 a.m. voice. The specific amount of faith required to keep going when every signal said stop. That context is invisible to everyone but you, and it makes a modest number feel like a crack of thunder in a quiet room. You close the screen. You open it again. You close it. You want to tell someone. You run through the list. Who would understand? Not understand the number, understand the weight, the distance between here and the ironing board, the distance between here and the taxi, the distance between this Tuesday and every Tuesday that came before it. There is no one. Not because the people in your life are insufficient, because the context required to understand this moment is years long and entirely internal. So you sit with it alone, the way you've sat with everything, and you let it be what it is. Not a destination, a signal, a frequency that confirms you're moving in the right direction.
What changes? Your relationship with belief. Before, you hoped. Now, you know. Not know in the way people say they know when they're trying to convince themselves. Know the way you know that heat follows fire. You've seen it happen. In your own account, with your own name on it. The ceiling is breakable. Not theoretically, specifically. You have the receipt. What gets harder? The fear. Because before, failure meant embarrassment. Now, failure means losing something real, something you built with years you can't get back. The fear doesn't shrink as the number grows, it changes shape. It becomes sharper, more specific, more detailed in its projections of what could go wrong. You don't celebrate, you reinvest. You stay in the apartment that's too small. You keep the car that's too old. You eat the same meals. Not because you're performing discipline, because the distance between here and where you started is still short enough to see with the naked eye, and you refuse to build a lifestyle on a foundation that hasn't been tested by time. Keep going. That's the only instruction. Keep going. Level 5, the number. It happens on a day you'll barely remember. That's the strange part. You'd think you'd remember every detail, the weather, the time, the exact position of your hands. You don't, because by the time it happens, you've checked the numbers so many times that the act of checking has become mechanical, routine, muscle memory. But this time, the number is different. This time, the number has 7 figures, and all of them belong to you. 1 million, tied to your name, your social security number, your signature. The kid who wore the same 3 shirts, the kid who didn't get the permission slip signed, the kid who learned to stop asking because the look on his parents' face was worse than the no. That kid has $1 million.